The wind screamed across the jagged cliffs of Forgotten Isle, like the death rattle of some ancient beast. Captain Elias Crane stood at the edge of the rocks, his weathered coat snapping violently behind him, salt spray stinging his face like tiny needles. The storm had been building for 3 days now, churning the Atlantic into a frothing monster that clawed at the island's shores with foam-white fingers. He'd seen worse in his 43 years at sea, but never had he felt so small, so utterly insignificant before nature's fury. The island had been his prison for 7 years. 7 long years since the mutiny, since his crew had cast him off with nothing but a rowboat and a prayer that never reached heaven. His ship, the Serpent's Kiss, lay gutted on the northern beach, her ribs exposed like some prehistoric creature, slowly being devoured by barnacles and time. Most days Elias welcomed the solitude. Most days he could forget the sound of his first mate's laughter as they'd left him to die. But tonight was different. Tonight, something in his bones told him the world was about to shift. He'd come down to the beach searching for driftwood, anything to keep his meager fire burning through the storm. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the rain fell in sheets so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. His lantern swung wildly from his calloused hand, casting dancing shadows across the black sand that looked like writhing serpents. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a piece of his old ship, some massive timber torn free by the tempest. But as he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. No, something far more than a woman. She lay sprawled across the beach like a fallen titan, her body stretching nearly 12 feet from head to toe. Her skin held an otherworldly luminescence, pale blue-green like sea foam under moonlight, and it seemed to pulse faintly with each shallow breath she took. Elias dropped to his knees beside her, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Her face was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. High cheekbones, full lips the color of coral, and even in unconsciousness, an expression of such profound sadness that he felt tears prick his eyes. Her hair spread around her like dark seaweed, tangled with shells and fragments of something that looked like crushed pearls. "Sweet Christ," he whispered, his voice lost in the howling wind. "What are you?" Her chest rose and fell irregularly, each breath seeming to cost her everything. A massive gash ran along her left side from ribs to hip, and from it seeped not blood but something that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. Elias had been a ship's surgeon before he'd been a captain, back when he still believed in saving lives rather than taking them. His hands moved on instinct, pressing against the wound, trying to staunch the flow of whatever strange ichor ran through her veins. She was dying. He could see it in the way her skin had begun to lose its shimmer, fading to a dull gray like a fish too long out of water. Around her neck hung a pendant of black pearl and silver, carved with symbols he'd never seen in any port from Boston to Barbados. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, growing dimmer with each passing moment. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to run, to leave this impossible creature to whatever fate had cast her upon his shore. But Elias Crane had spent 7 years talking to ghosts and drowning his regrets in bad rum. He'd lost his humanity piece by piece on this cursed rock, watching it wash away with each tide. Maybe saving her could give him back a fragment of what he'd once been. "I've got you," he said, knowing she couldn't hear him, needing to say it anyway. "I've got you, lass." He ran back to his camp, a pathetic collection of salvaged canvas and driftwood nestled in the lee of a cliff. His hands shook as he gathered everything he had: strips of torn sail for bandages, his last bottle of whiskey for disinfectant, needles made from fish bones, and threads salvaged from his old uniform. The storm raged around him as he worked, rain turning the ground to mud that sucked at his boots with each desperate step. Getting her to shelter proved nearly impossible. Even unconscious, she weighed more than any human had a right to, and dragging her across the sand left him gasping, muscles screaming, his back feeling like it might snap. But he persevered, inch by agonizing inch, until finally he had her beneath the largest section of his makeshift shelter. The torn mainsail of the Serpent's Kiss stretched between 2 massive pieces of driftwood. For the next 6 hours, Elias worked with the focus of a man possessed. He cleaned the wound as best he could, his hands steady despite his racing heart. The strange fluid that leaked from her was warm, warmer than blood should be, and where it touched his skin, it left a tingling sensation that lasted for minutes. He stitched the gash closed with trembling fingers, whispering prayers to gods he'd long since abandoned, begging them to let her live. As dawn approached, and the storm finally began to break, her breathing steadied. The gray pallor faded from her skin, replaced once more by that ethereal glow. The pendant at her throat began to pulse more strongly, and for just a moment her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of the deep ocean, dark blue-green and infinite, holding depths that no human eye could fathom. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Surprise, perhaps, or fear, or something else entirely. Her lips moved, forming words in a language that sounded like waves breaking against stone, like wind whistling through coral caves. Then her eyes closed again, and she fell into what Elias hoped was healing sleep. He sat back against a piece of driftwood, exhausted beyond measure, watching the first rays of sunlight break through the dissipating clouds. The ocean had calmed to a gentle roll, almost peaceful, as if the storm had never been. But something felt different. The air held a charge, an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Far out on the horizon, the water began to glow. She opened her eyes 3 days later, and Elias nearly dropped the coconut he'd been trying to crack open. He'd been sitting beside her constantly, leaving only to gather food and fresh water from the island's single spring. In that time, her wound had healed with impossible speed, the flesh knitting together until only a faint silvery scar remained, like a river of mercury running across her skin. "You're awake," he said stupidly, then cursed himself. Of course she was awake. Those impossible eyes were staring directly at him, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen pinned beneath glass. He set down the coconut carefully, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I mean you no harm. You were hurt. I helped." She sat up slowly, gracefully, despite her enormous size. The makeshift shelter suddenly felt impossibly small with her in it. She had to hunch her shoulders to avoid tearing through the canvas ceiling. Her gaze swept over the camp, taking in the pitiful collection of salvaged goods, the cold fire pit, the rusted tools that represented everything Elias owned in this world. Then her eyes returned to him, and something in them softened. When she spoke, her voice was like nothing he'd ever heard, deep and melodic, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest. The language was still incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakably questioning. She gestured to herself, then to the ocean, then to him, her movements fluid and purposeful. "I don't understand," Elias said, frustration creeping into his voice. He pointed to himself. "Elias. My name is Elias." Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She tilted her head, considering. Her hand moved to the black pearl pendant at her throat, and as her fingers touched it, the symbols carved into its surface began to glow with soft blue light. She closed her eyes, her lips moving silently, and when she opened them again and spoke, the words came out in accented but unmistakable English. "Marina," she said, the name rolling off her tongue like a wave. "I am called Marina." Her hand pressed against her chest, then moved to touch his shoulder. Her fingers were cool, and where they made contact, that same tingling sensation spread through his skin. "You saved Marina." Why? The question caught him off guard. Why? Because she was dying. Because he was human, or at least had been once. Because in 7 years of solitude he'd forgotten what it meant to care about anything beyond his own survival, and seeing her broken on that beach had reminded him. Because it was the right thing to do, he said finally, meeting her gaze. Because no one deserves to die alone on a beach, forgotten by the world. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers slowly. "Marina was running," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Running from duty, from destiny, from—" She trailed off, her expression darkening. "From choice that was not Marina's to make." Elias knew something about running from destiny. He'd spent most of his adult life doing exactly that. "What were you running from?" Marina's laugh was bitter, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of centuries. "Marriage. Marina's father, the King of Depths, has promised Marina to Kraketh, Lord of the Abyssal Trenches. Kraketh is powerful. Kraketh is ancient. Kraketh is—" She struggled for the word, her face twisting with disgust. "Monster." She stood then, and Elias had to crane his neck back to look at her. Even hunched beneath the low canvas, she was magnificent, towering, powerful. but with a vulnerability in her eyes that made his heart ache. She moved to the edge of the shelter, staring out at the ocean with an expression of such longing that Elias felt like an intruder witnessing something deeply private. Marina cannot go back, she continued. If Marina goes back, Marina becomes property, becomes tool for father's ambition, becomes, she pressed her palm against her chest right over her heart, becomes nothing. Elias stood, joining her at the edge of the shelter. The ocean stretched before them, deceptively calm under the morning sun, but he could see the tension in Marina's shoulders, the way her hands clenched and unclenched, as if preparing for a fight. Then don't go back, he said simply. Stay here. This island is forgotten by everyone. I've been here 7 years and haven't seen another living soul. You'd be safe. She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw both hope and terrible sadness. Marina's father is Thalasor, the Sea King. His dominion extends to every drop of water that touches your world. There is no hiding from him. He will come. He will find Marina. And when he does, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Over the next few days, an unlikely friendship formed between the castaway pirate and the runaway sea princess. Marina's presence transformed the island from a prison into something almost resembling a home. She was endlessly curious about human things, the way fire worked, how Elias caught fish, the purpose of his battered compass that no longer pointed north. In return, she told him stories of the world beneath the waves, of cities built from coral and pearl, of creatures that had never seen sunlight, of the ancient laws that governed her people. She told him about her father, Thalasor, who had ruled the oceans for 3,000 years, how he had fought the gods themselves for dominion over the seas, how his word was absolute law, enforced by an army of leviathans and sea dragons that could sink entire fleets with a single breath, how he loved his daughter, in his own terrible way, but loved his kingdom more. Father believes marriage to Kraketh will bring peace, Marina explained one evening as they sat by the fire. She'd learned to make herself smaller somehow, compacting her form until she was merely 8 feet tall instead of 12. It still hurt her. Elias could see the strain in her face, but she insisted, saying it made conversation easier. The abyssal trenches have been threatening war for centuries. Kraketh's father nearly destroyed the kingdom before my grandfather defeated him. This marriage would unite our houses, would prevent bloodshed. At the cost of your happiness, Elias said, poking at the fire with a stick. Seems like a steep price. What is one life against thousands? Marina asked, but there was no conviction in her voice. This is what father says. This is what councils say. This is what duty demands. Duty. Elias spat the word like a curse. I know something about duty. Duty made me a captain at 25. Duty made me follow orders I knew were wrong. Duty got good men killed and made me into something I didn't recognize in the mirror. He looked up at her, seeing his own pain reflected in her eyes. Sometimes duty is just a pretty word for slavery. They fell into silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the eternal song of the waves. Elias found himself studying her in the firelight, the way her skin seemed to shimmer with inner light, the graceful curve of her neck, the sadness that never quite left her eyes. She was the most beautiful and most tragic thing he'd ever seen. Elias, she said suddenly, her voice hesitant, if Marina stays, if Marina fights for freedom, will Elias help? He should have said no, should have told her that he was just a broken old pirate who'd lost everything worth losing, should have explained that he couldn't even save himself, let alone her. But when he looked into those deep ocean eyes, he found himself nodding. Yes, he said, I'll help you. She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. She reached out, her hand engulfing his, and squeezed gently. The touch sent warmth flooding through him, chasing away the cold that had lived in his bones for 7 years. That night, Elias dreamed of the ocean rising up to swallow the island whole. He woke to Marina's hand on his shoulder, shaking him urgently. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, charged with the same electricity he'd felt the night he'd found her. He comes, Marina whispered, her voice trembling. Father comes. Marina can feel him in the water, can feel his rage. Elias scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. Far out on the horizon, the ocean had begun to glow with an otherworldly light. The water was rising, swelling, forming a shape that grew larger with each passing second. "What do we do?" he asked, knowing the answer even as the words left his mouth. Marina stood, drawing herself up to her full height, and in that moment she looked every inch the princess she was, regal, powerful, and utterly terrified. "We face him," she said. Together. The ocean erupted. The water didn't just rise. It exploded upward in a column of foam and fury that seemed to pierce the very heavens. Elias staggered backward, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The column twisted and coalesced, taking form, becoming something that defied every law of nature he'd ever known. Lightning crackled around it, blue-white and blinding, and the thunder that followed wasn't sound so much as a physical force that knocked him to his knees. When his vision cleared, Thalassor stood in the shallows. The Sea King was massive, easily twice Marina's height, his form seeming to shift between solid flesh and living water. His skin was the deep blue-black of the ocean at midnight, shot through with veins of bioluminescent light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Coral grew from his shoulders like armor, encrusted with barnacles and anemones that swayed as if still underwater. His face was both terrible and magnificent, ancient beyond measure, with eyes that held the weight of millennia, and a mouth filled with teeth like shards of ice. A crown of twisted silver and black pearl sat upon his head, and from it grew living tendrils of kelp that moved with their own sinister intelligence. But it was his presence that truly unmade Elias. The sheer force of Thalassor's being pressed down on him like the weight of the entire ocean, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to be anything, except a terrified speck of humanity cowering before the wrath of an angry god. His legs trembled, threatening to give out entirely. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything except stand here and face this impossible creature. Marina stepped forward, placing herself between Elias and her father. Despite her fear, and Elias could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands shook, she held her ground. When she spoke, her voice carried across the beach with surprising strength, though Elias noticed she'd reverted to her native tongue. The language of the deep was like music played on instruments of bone and shell, beautiful and alien and utterly incomprehensible to human ears. Thalassor's response came like the voice of the ocean itself, deep, resonant, and filled with barely contained rage. The water around his feet began to churn and boil. Elias didn't need to understand the words to grasp their meaning. The Sea King's fury was palpable, rolling off him in waves that made the very air taste of salt and ozone. The argument escalated quickly, father and daughter shouting at each other in their strange tongue while the ocean behind Thalassor rose higher and higher, forming massive walls of water that loomed over the island like the hands of some wrathful deity preparing to crush an insect. Marina's pendant blazed with light, and her own form seemed to grow, her skin taking on a deeper luminescence as she drew on whatever power flowed through her veins. Then Thalassor's gaze fell on Elias, and the pirate felt his blood turn to ice. The Sea King moved with impossible speed, crossing the distance between them in a single stride. His hand, easily the size of Elias's entire torso, shot out and lifted the pirate into the air by his throat. Elias kicked uselessly, his fingers scrabbling at the iron grip, unable to draw breath. Black spots danced across his vision. Through the roaring in his ears, he heard Marina scream. Thalassor brought Elias close to his face, those ancient eyes studying him with the same detached curiosity a man might show an interesting insect. When he spoke, the words came out in perfect, unaccented English, each syllable dripping with contempt. "This is what stays my daughter from her duty? This mortal?" The disgust in his voice was absolute. "This creature whose life is but a heartbeat? This thing of flesh and weakness who will be dust before a single tide of my reign has passed?" Elias tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but no air would come. His vision was narrowing to a tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. He was going to die. After 7 years of surviving on this cursed island, he was going to die at the hands of an angry god, because he'd been foolish enough to show kindness to the wrong person. "Father, no!" Marina's hand clamped down on Thalassor's wrist, her voice cracked with desperation. "Please. He saved Marina's life. He asks nothing. He knows nothing of our world. He is innocent." "Innocent?" Thalassor's laugh was like grinding icebergs. "No mortal is innocent. They are born corrupt, live corrupt, die corrupt. They poison my oceans with their greed. They slaughter my children for sport. They take and take and take until there is nothing left to give. His grip tightened fractionally, and Elias felt something in his throat begin to collapse. And now one has taken my daughter, has filled her head with ideas of freedom and choice, has made her forget who she is, what she is. No, Marina said, and there was steel in her voice now. Elias showed Marina what Marina had forgotten, that there is more to life than duty and obligation, that one life does matter, that kindness still exists in this world, even in the most broken places. She released her father's wrist and instead placed her hand over Elias's chest, right over his rapidly failing heart. The touch sent warmth flooding through him, and suddenly he could breathe again, even with Thalassor's hand around his throat. The black spots receded. The tunnel of his vision widened. Marina will not marry Kraketh, she declared, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. Marina will not be traded like property to prevent a war that father's pride started. Marina will choose her own path, even if that path leads to death. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any storm. Thalassor stared at his daughter with an expression that cycled through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been pain. The walls of water behind him grew impossibly higher, blocking out the sun, casting the entire island in shadow. The pendant at Marina's throat blazed so brightly it hurt to look at. You would defy me? Thalassor's voice had gone quiet, which somehow made it more menacing. You would throw away everything, your position, your people, your heritage. For this? He shook Elias slightly, like a dog with a rat. For a mortal who will be gone in the blink of an eye? Yes, Marina said simply. If that is what it takes to be free, then yes. Something broke in Thalassor's face. The rage drained away, replaced by a sorrow so profound it was painful to witness. He lowered Elias to the ground, releasing him. The pirate collapsed, gasping and coughing, his throat feeling like it had been crushed beneath a ship's anchor. Marina knelt beside him, her hands hovering over him anxiously, and he managed a weak nod to show he was alive. You do not understand what you ask, Thalassor said, his voice heavy with the weight of ages. Kraketh will not accept this dishonor lightly. The abyssal trenches will march to war. Thousands will die. The oceans will run red with blood. Entire kingdoms will fall, and it will all be because my daughter chose her heart over her duty. Then let them march, Marina said, though her voice trembled. Marina will not live a lie, will not pretend to love a monster, will not sacrifice her soul for a peace built on suffering. Thalassor closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they held a terrible resignation. You are so much like your mother, he said softly. She too was willing to burn the world for love. It is what killed her in the end. He raised his hand, and the walls of water began to recede, flowing back toward the ocean. But his gaze had hardened once more, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy. Very well. I give you 3 days. 3 days to come to your senses and return home of your own will. 3 days to remember who you are and what you owe to your people. He pointed at Elias, and the gesture felt like a death sentence. 3 days to say goodbye to your mortal. After that I will return, and if you still refuse your duty, I will drag you back to the depths myself, and I will drown this island and everything on it. The mortal will die. This place will be forgotten even by the fish, and you will marry Kraketh, whether you will it or no. Father, Marina began, but Thalassor cut her off with a gesture. 3 days, daughter. Use them wisely. He turned and walked back into the ocean. With each step his form became less solid, more water than flesh, until by the time the waves closed over his head, he had dissolved completely. The sea calmed as quickly as it had raged, returning to its normal, peaceful rhythm as if nothing had happened. Marina helped Elias to his feet, her face stricken. I am sorry, she whispered. Marina has brought doom to your island. To you. This was mistake. Marina should leave before... No, Elias croaked, his throat still raw. He grabbed her hand, holding it tight. You're not going anywhere. We have 3 days. That's more time than I've had to solve most of the problems in my life. He managed a weak smile. Besides, I'm not ready to say goodbye yet. She looked down at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and squeezed his hand back. Then we face this together? Together, he confirmed, though in his heart he had no idea how they could possibly win against a god. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and blue, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed his own death warrant. But looking at Marina, seeing the hope and determination in her face, he found he didn't care. For the first time in 7 years, he had something worth fighting for. Even if that fight was doomed from the start, 3 days had never passed so quickly. Elias and Marina spent every waking moment together, as if by filling the hours with words and companionship, they could somehow hold back the inevitable. They sat by the fire at night sharing stories of their vastly different lives. She told him about swimming through forests of bioluminescent kelp, about riding currents that spanned continents, about the music her people made from whale song and the grinding of tectonic plates. He told her about his first ship, about the stars he'd navigated by, about the daughter he'd had once so many years ago, before disease had taken her and grief had driven him to the bottle, and the poor decisions that followed. On the second day, Marina showed him her magic. She sang in her native tongue, and the water responded, rising from the ocean in graceful arcs, forming shapes and creatures that danced in the air before splashing back down. She healed the old wounds that troubled him, the shoulder that ached in cold weather, the fingers broken and poorly set years ago, the constant pain in his back. Her touch was gentle, warm, and each time their skin met, Elias felt that electric tingle that spoke of a connection deeper than mere friendship. By the third morning, they both knew what neither wanted to say aloud. Time had run out. They stood together on the beach where he'd first found her, watching the sun rise over an ocean that seemed to be holding its breath. Marina had returned to her full height, no longer trying to make herself smaller. She was magnificent in the dawn light, every inch the princess she'd been born to be. "Marina has decided," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Marina will return to father. We'll marry Kraketh. We'll do her duty." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "What? No. We talked about this. You don't have to—" "Yes," she interrupted, turning to face him. Tears streamed down her face, glowing faintly blue in the morning light. "Marina does have to. Cannot let thousands die for Marina's happiness. Cannot let father destroy this place. Cannot let Elias—" Her voice broke. "Cannot let Elias die." He grabbed her hands, desperate. "There has to be another way. We can fight. We can run. We can—" "There is no running from the Sea King," she said, her voice infinitely sad. "There is no fighting him." Marina knew this from the beginning. These 3 days were were more than Marina deserved. "Don't say that." Elias felt his own tears coming now, hot and bitter. "You deserve everything. You deserve freedom. You deserve love. You deserve—" She kissed him then, bending down to press her lips against his. It was gentle and desperate all at once, tasting of salt and sorrow. When she pulled back, she touched his face with trembling fingers. "Marina found all of that here," she whispered. "With you." For 3 days, Marina was free. For 3 days, Marina was loved. It is enough. It has to be enough. The ocean began to glow. Thalasser was coming. Marina straightened, squaring her shoulders, preparing to face her fate. But Elias wasn't ready to let her go. An idea had been forming in his mind, desperate and probably foolish, but it was all he had. "Wait," he said. "Before you go, before you sacrifice everything, let me try something. Let me speak to him." She looked at him like he'd gone mad. "Elias, no. Father will what? Kill me? I'm dead anyway when he drowns this island. At least let me try." He squeezed her hands. "Please. You gave up everything for 3 days of freedom. Let me give you this." The Sea King rose from the waves, terrible and magnificent. But this time Elias didn't cower. He stepped forward, placing himself between Marina and her father, and looked up into those ancient eyes with all the courage he could muster. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I ask for one thing before you take her. Let me go in her place." Thalassor's expression was unreadable. "Explain. You need this marriage to prevent war, but what you really need is a gesture. A sacrifice, a symbol of commitment." Elias took a deep breath. "I'm nothing, a forgotten pirate on a forgotten island. But if you took me, if you made me part of your court, a hostage, a guarantee of good faith, wouldn't that serve the same purpose? Marina marries freely someday to someone of her choosing, and I ensure she keeps her word." "Elias, no." Marina grabbed his shoulder. You cannot. It's already done, he said softly, not taking his eyes off Thalasar. I'm making the choice you wouldn't let yourself make. For a long moment, the Sea King said nothing. Then, impossibly, he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, but it held a grudging respect. You would trade your freedom for hers? Your life for hers? Without hesitation, Ilias said. She showed me how to be human again. Let me show her what that humanity can do. Thalasar looked at his daughter, then back at Ilias. Very well, mortal. I accept your bargain. You will come to my kingdom. You will serve me until I deem the debt paid, and my daughter will be free to choose her own path. He leaned closer. But know this. You will never see the sun again. Never feel the wind. Never return to this world. Can you accept that price? Elias turned to Marina, seeing his own grief reflected in her eyes. He smiled, trying to memorize every detail of her face. For her, yes. Marina pulled him into an embrace that lifted him off his feet. Fool, she sobbed into his shoulder. Beautiful, stupid, brave fool. Takes one to know one, he whispered back. As Thalasar's hand closed around him and the ocean rose to claim its prize, Elias looked back one last time at the island that had been his prison and his salvation. Then the water closed over his head, and he descended into the deep, carrying with him the memory of 3 perfect days, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from choosing your own chains.